Welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Jackie Davie. I am a pediatric audiologist by education and by many years of experience, over 20 years of experience. I'm going to teach you today about drawing a pedigree. Now, first off, I want to tell you a little bit about why we might want to draw a pedigree. Often in the practice of pediatric audiology, and even sometimes with adult assessment, what we get asked is, well, what caused my child's hearing loss? What causes my hearing loss? And I wanted to give you a couple examples about how we can do an evaluation in order to determine if genetics may be in fact a cause of this person's hearing loss. I'm going to draw a pedigree today, and this is actually not related to hearing loss per se, but in fact to communication disorders in general. We're going to go through an example of determining whether or not we should refer this person for a genetic evaluation. As you may know, there are many different evaluations available for determining what a genetic cause of hearing loss may be. So I'm going to go through an example of a family who's concerned about having autism spectrum disorder in their lineage. I'm going to start off with some basic symbols here. You can see here I've started with two of our basic most symbols, which is our male symbol and our female symbol. The male is a box and the female is a circle. If you want a full list of pedigree analyses symbols, there's one attached to the pedigree drawing practice question in the blackboard. And I'm going to show you what that one looks like. You will see you'll have a printout of different information here, of all the different symbols that you might need. So you might want to have this in hand as you go to practice and do this with me. Okay? So we're going to get started over here. We have a family who's interested in determining whether they have, if they're going to have another child, what is the risk of that child having autism spectrum disorder. The family actually has two children right now. The first child was born normally, no problems. Normal intelligence, normal social skills, normal cognitive functioning. They had a second child who looked normal when they was first born, began to have some health problems, and then developed into having autism spectrum disorder. They're still young, so they're interested in determining whether their child that they want to have, the third child, potentially does have a chance of having autism spectrum disorder. So we're going to start off with looking at the proband. The proband is a fancy word for our case of interest. So this is the child that we're interested in learning. So we're going to start off with our first generation. You can see here my pedigree. We usually break them up into generations. So our first generation is the children. So I'm going to start here in the center and put the children down that we know. So this family now has two male children. And then their proband, which is the case of interest, is actually a little bit different of a symbol. We usually use a diamond shape because that signifies to us that we don't know what the gender is of that individual. So I'm going to put a diamond down for the third child, as we really don't know who that child is going to be. All of these children are related to each other. We're going to connect them here to the mother and father. So we have the mom and the dad. So here's our mom and here's our dad. We can add in a bunch of additional information too to help. So we can add in the ages, how their health is on each of these different individuals. So say we have here, we have a 5-year-old, and he is alive and well. And then we have a 3-year-old. And this one is not alive and well. So what we're going to do is we're going to mark that child in a special way. That child has autism, so I'm going to make a symbol here that lets me know that this is an affected individual. Over on the side, then I'm going to add that to my key. So over here in my key, I'm going to signify what each of the different symbols means. So for my first affected one, I'm going to put in exactly as I had it drawn here and mark it as autism. So I'll shorten that by ASD, or autism spectrum disorder. Now I'm going to go on and determine the next level of people. So this individual, the dad, has 3 siblings. So I'm going to add those 3 siblings in. So in that family, there were 3 other children, and they were all males. Lucky them. So of the 3 here, and then you can also add their children in as well. I'm going to connect them by their mother and father. A couple of these things that I'm doing here is that I'm connecting individuals that are genetically related to each other. So you can see these 2 people mated. So I'm drawing a straight line in between them. Doesn't mean necessarily marriage, but they did mate with each other and had 4 children. Okay? So they go down to the next generation. And then I can put in their children. So the oldest son here had no offspring, so I'm not going to add anybody in for him. The second oldest child here had 3 offspring. So I'm going to put down here 3 different children. So they had a girl and then 2 boys. And then the third son had 1 child, and that was a daughter. If I'm interested, I can also add their mates in, but we know that a man cannot have a child on their own genetically, so they must have a partner in order to have that. So, you can add the females in, but at this point, we're not really interested in their genetic information. Okay. So I'm going to do the same over here. So for the mother is an only child to this pair. So we have the mother and the father. But the mother had 2 additional children, but to a second husband. So I'm going to add that person in, and then add the other 2 offspring. Now I'm doing the best that I can to keep all of the same generation in line with it. It's a little difficult on the board, so I hope you understand. You could do this with paper that I have provided for you that keeps everything in line. You can also do this on the computer, which keeps it a little neater as well. I put this person in just to show that there's somebody else involved, but you don't necessarily need them because their genetic information is really of no interest here to the program. Don't forget, like I did, to mark the proban, which with an arrow here. You can also put a P in here for pregnancy as well. Okay. From this individual, I can then put the additional grandparents in for this person. So here we have mom and dad. And then this person here, the grandmother, has multiple siblings as well. So I'm going to put them in because they are of interest to me. Her siblings, she had 7 brothers. So instead of writing all 7 out, I might signify here by putting a box and putting 7 in there. And then in addition, they had 5 sisters. So for these very large families, it helps to collapse all the people together and put some individuals in there. Now, each of these groups of people had multiple children themselves, so we can add those in as well. So for here, especially if there's something of interest over here. So I'm going to put in 2 groups here. The children of interest and the children who are not of interest. So here we're going to put in about 20 children here, and then there's 1 interesting case over here. So I'm going to put him by himself. And then over on this side, we have an additional, I'm just going to make up a number, 20 children here, but there's no one of interest over on the female side. Okay. From here, I'm going to add the grandparents in. I'm sorry, the great-grandparents in to this child. Let me erase that. Okay. So let me count the generations here. So we have 1 generation, 2 generation, 3 generation, 4 generation. Okay. In here, now I'm going to go back and ask the people, now that we've got a 4-generation family tree, who are the people that have something interesting going on that may be related to a possible genetic disorder? So, since they're interested in determining how many people have autism in the family to see if autism is in fact a genetic disorder and something that wasn't necessarily acquired, I'm going to go back and ask, was there anybody else in the family that had autism? And in fact, they do tell you that over on this side of the family, there is a first cousin who has autism spectrum disorder. So I'm going to mark that in. Then I'm going to get some additional information. Additional information is that this child is also 3 years old. Anybody else have autism in the family? Yes, actually that cousin that marked over here, they also have autism spectrum disorder. Now, current research is suggesting that autism spectrum disorder, the reason that we use the word spectrum is that there's a large variety of different problems that may be associated with it. So with autism spectrum disorder, you usually have a communication issue, usually have some sort of a cognitive issue, a social issue. So maybe those things are of interest as well. So if it's a spectrum, maybe it is in fact what we call a syndrome. A syndrome being that there's multiple problems going on, but not necessarily everybody who gets that disorder has everything associated with that disorder. So let's go back through. You know, we know that autism has language issues. We know that it has cognitive issues. So let's ask the family about that. Is there anybody else that has language issues or speech issues in the family? When in fact there is. A lot of the individuals on this side of the family, on the father's side of the family, do have language and speech issues. So I'm going to mark those in as well. But I'm going to make it a different symbol than this. So when you have syndromes, and a prime example would be a family with Treacher-Collins syndrome. Treacher-Collins has multiple issues that go along with it, but not everybody has the exact same thing. So if you know anything about Treacher-Collins, you might see the individual has slanted eyes, low set ears, hearing loss, but not everybody might have hearing loss. Not everybody with Treacher-Collins syndrome has the slanted eyes. Not everybody has the facial anomalies. So we can create something that as a symbol that could do multiple things. So you can either keep them completely separate, or you can create something that has like a box to it. I'm going to, just to make it clear, I'm going to create completely different symbols. So here, I'm going to put some squiggly lines in and call this speech and language disorder. Okay? So I'm going to go back in and mark those individuals that had speech and language disorders. So you can see here we've got multiple generations of people with speech and language disorders. So even though we only saw autism in the youngest generation, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the only thing that's occurring. Okay. When we do this, it helps us to evaluate whether a disorder is autosomally related, meaning it's non-sex gene. Is it sex gene related, such as an X-linked or a Y-linked disorder? Is it dominant, meaning that you have multiple generations that have that same problem? Or is it recessive, meaning that genes are there, They don't necessarily rear their heads, but you get that right combination, and then you see that problem occurring. Okay? So the fact that we're seeing multiple layers of this may suggest that this is some form of syndromic problem, and that each generation maybe it's getting a little bit worse than we're seeing. So I'm going to add additional in. When you go back through and think about speech issues, you can have pragmatic issues, you can have language issues, and we have grandma here who has pragmatic issues. We also have the two uncles. Uncle number one didn't start talking until he was 5 years of age. Uncle number two also has pragmatic issues. And then we look over on this side of the family here. We have some other problems that go with it, like social issues. So I'm going to mark social issues as a little bit different. So let's do social issues. Let's do it as a crosshatch. Okay. So now all of a sudden we're seeing it in multiple places over here as well. Another thing that we see with autism spectrum disorder, and they've recently realized this, is that families who have incidents of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are more likely to have or at greater risk of having children with a autism spectrum disorder. Some sort of link through that, they haven't quite figured it out. And I bring this up because interesting thing is that Dad was diagnosed with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, when he was a child. So we're going to put that in as well. So what have I not used? Let's use a solid one. Okay. So now we get a bigger, better, clearer picture. The one thing that we want to figure out is, are we seeing this over multiple generations, and who needs to be tested? Let me mark down here. So when we have these individuals, we want to figure out, is this a vertical problem? Are we seeing a dominant pattern problem, or are we seeing a horizontal problem, which is recessive? And the reason we want to know this is because depending upon if it's a vertical problem or if it's a horizontal problem, it changes our risk factors and our associated problems that we might see with it. So because we are seeing this vertical pattern here, that puts this pregnancy at a higher risk of having a disorder. When we see this autosomal dominance going down from generation to generation, it increases the risk from being 25% if it's a recessive problem to 50% if it's a dominant problem. So it makes a huge difference. When we go back through also, we want to figure out, are all these things being caused by the same issue? So if we probe a little bit further, we find these two people over here. These two individuals over here had very similar birth problems that may have created it. So the uncle over here that has a social issue, we find out that he was having problems during prenatal period. He actually had meconium aspiration. This is an issue which can cause the social aspects, and it's not necessarily related to the genetic factors we're looking at. Similarly, this other cousin that's occurring over here also had a birth issue. The child was stuck in the womb. The skull didn't have time to grow properly, and that creates a small brain size, which then impacts and creates autism. Okay, that's the spectrum. So based upon this analysis, we can look and determine that this is an autosomal dominant issue. It gives us a little bit better understanding that maybe these people need to be tested for something that's autosomally dominant in the pattern, and it puts them at a greater risk of, if they have another child, of having this problem as well. I hope this gives a good example about how you can use pedigree analysis in your audiologic practice so that you can use this to help your clients get a little bit better understanding of what might be causing the problems that they're seeing in their family. Thank you. Now you can go ahead and try to do Lisa, who is the example pedigree that I've given you. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you. Take care.